The scorching sun mercilessly burned the earth, reflecting off the scorched dust that covered the boards of the auction yard. A crowd of farmers and buyers slowly moved between the pens, their voices blending into an indistinct murmur, interrupted by the neighing of horses. It was an ordinary day for such a place. Horses of various colors and breeds patiently awaited their fate, displaying their strong legs, smooth coats, and majestic postures. Some animals stood out with their exceptional build, attracting the greedy gazes of connoisseurs, while others remained almost unnoticed. However, in the farthest corner of the yard, there was a pen that no one even approached. In this forgotten place stood a thin, exhausted horse. Its coat had lost its luster and was covered in dust. Its emaciation was so starkly emphasized by its protruding ribs that it looked more like a shadow of an animal than a proud representative of its breed. Small groups of men cast fleeting glances at this pen, only to mock the pitiful state of the animal. "This horse couldn't even pull a hay cart," one of them sneered. "And the best place for it is the slaughterhouse," another added, causing an outburst of crude laughter. But one woman did notice it. Emma Longmire made her way through the crowd with a determined look, her faded jeans and worn boots clearly indicating that she knew what she was doing. The woman's face was focused, but her gaze remained clear and sharp, as if she was looking for something that others couldn't see. When Emma stopped in front of the forgotten pen, her heart ached. The horse stood with its head lowered, as if completely resigned to being unnoticed. Its eyes were tired, but deep within those dark pools, Emma saw a tiny glimmer of hope. "What are you doing here, boy?" she whispered, carefully reaching her hand through the wooden fence. The horse initially froze, but then slowly raised its head, its gaze meeting Emma's eyes. It was a moment, but it was full of meaning, a connection that required no words. Something deep and almost inexplicable made the woman take a step back and make a decision. "Are you really going to take this wreck?" came the mocking voice of an elderly farmer standing nearby. "Yes, I am," Emma replied firmly, without even glancing at the man. She knew that her bid would be met with laughter and mockery, but it didn't matter. The auctioneer, barely concealing his boredom, announced the horse. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the bidding to begin, but no hand was raised. No one but Emma. "I'll take him," she declared loudly. Her voice was firm, but there was a warm resolve in it that silenced even the most sarcastic. When the auctioneer named a symbolic price, Emma handed over the money without a moment's hesitation. Leading the horse to her, she gently stroked its muzzle. "From now on, I'll call you Shadow," she said with a smile. "You will never be abandoned again." The crowd watched her leave with a mixture of bewilderment and slight contempt. Emma led Shadow away from the noisy auction, holding her head high despite the mocking glances. Her thoughts were focused not on those around her, but on what lay ahead. As they reached the trail leading to her family ranch in the San Luis Valley, the sun began to set, painting the landscape in deep shades of orange and pink. Shadow walked slowly, but with each step, his breathing became steadier, and his movements a bit more confident. Emma stroked his neck, whispering words of encouragement. "We'll make it, Shadow. We have a big road ahead of us." But she knew this road would not only be long, but also full of trials that would test their bond and her resolve. The sun's rays struggled to break through the dense canopy of trees, tracing intricate patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Emma walked along the trail, holding the reins of the exhausted Shadow. The horse stepped uncertainly, its thin legs trembling under the weight of its own body. Each step seemed like a trial to him, but Emma did not rush, allowing Shadow to go at his own pace. "It's all right, boy," she said gently, encouragingly patting his neck. "We're almost home." The road to the ranch was not easy. Winding trails overgrown with wild grass crossed hills and small streams. Emma periodically stopped to let Shadow rest. She would sit next to him on the dry grass, watching his dark, midnight-like eyes. There was still more pain than life in them, but in rare moments, her gaze caught a faint glimmer of hidden strength. In the distance, like a silhouette against the golden sunset, the house appeared. A small but cozy wooden structure with a sloping roof and a porch where Henry Carlisle, her grandfather, always stood. At that moment, he was sitting in his old rocking chair, intently studying the horizon. When he noticed the approaching Emma and her companion, his stern, wrinkled features softened with curiosity and slight concern. Emma raised her hand in greeting. Shadow paused for a moment, raising his head as if he also sensed the approach of something new. Henry stood up, leaning on an old wooden cane, and slowly descended from the porch. "What is this emaciated creature?" he asked, squinting and surveying the frail body of the horse. Emma stopped in front of him, extending the reins so Shadow could stand calmly. Her face was determined, but her voice held a slight note of excitement. "This is Shadow, Grandpa," she said. "I bought him at the auction." Henry ran his hand through his thick gray beard, nodding slowly as if pondering her words. He walked around the horse, carefully examining every curve of its emaciated body. The ribs stood out under the coat, and the weakened legs trembled from the long journey. "Is this some kind of rescue mission?" he remarked dryly, though there was no malice in his voice, only caution. "He looks like he belongs in a junkyard stable." Emma pursed her lips but replied firmly, "No, Grandpa. He needs care, time, and faith. I know he'll make it." Henry huffed, leaning on his cane, and looked her straight in the eyes. "Well, if you're so sure, girl, he's your responsibility. You'll take care of him, feed him, water him, train him. I won't back you up if you make mistakes." "I understand everything," Emma nodded. Her voice was steady, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. Henry pointed to a pen next to the stable. "Set him up there. Tomorrow morning we'll talk about what to do next." In the pen, Emma set up a temporary corner for Shadow. She brought hay, placed a bucket of fresh water, and left him to rest. The horse drank slowly, as if afraid that this was all he would get. Emma sat down next to him, leaning against a wooden fence post, and watched him. "From now on, Shadow, everything will be different," she whispered softly. "You are no longer alone. We'll make it together." Shadow raised his head, fixing his tired but warm gaze on her. It was a brief moment, but in it, Emma felt a confirmation of her faith. The horse had trusted her, if only a little, but it was a beginning. Late that evening, when Henry came out to check on his granddaughter, he found her sleeping by the fence. Shadow stood nearby, as if guarding her peace. Henry squinted, looking at the unusual scene. "Maybe there really is something in you, boy," he muttered, addressing Shadow before returning to the house. The night in the San Luis Valley was peaceful. Under the starlit sky, a new bond was born, delicate but promising something great. The sun bathed the ranch in golden light, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut hay. The morning dawned clear but cool, with a light breeze blowing through the San Luis Valley. Emma woke up early, feeling an unusual surge of energy. She knew that a tough day lay ahead, a day that would mark the beginning of Shadow's long road to recovery. When she approached the pen, the horse stood motionless, slowly chewing the remains of the hay. Its frail body still showed its ribs, but there was a barely perceptible spark of strength in its stance, as if it was beginning to accept that it belonged here. "Good morning, Shadow," Emma greeted, reaching out her hand. The horse lazily raised its head, and its dark eyes met hers. Emma carefully offered a carrot. Shadow initially tensed, but then, after a few seconds of hesitation, cautiously took it with his lips and began to chew. "That's it, boy," Emma smiled. "This is just the beginning." From early morning, Emma began by preparing a special grain mixture with supplements to help restore Shadow's strength. She added some salts to the water for hydration and began cleaning his coat of dirt and dust. Each of her gestures was measured and gentle, so as not to frighten the horse, who was used to roughness and indifference. Henry, watching this from the shade of the porch, crossed his arms over his chest. His gaze was penetrating, but with a hint of a slight smile, barely noticeable under his thick beard. "You're spending a lot of time on him, girl," he noted, approaching. "Do you think it's all worth it?" Emma straightened up, meeting his gaze. "I think so. Everyone deserves a second chance, even if no one believes in it." Henry nodded, stroking his cane. "Confidence is a good thing, but remember, horses are not people. Sometimes they break in a way that can't be fixed. But since you've chosen this path, go all the way. The first test for Shadow was to leave the pen and go to the spacious pasture. Emma decided that freedom of movement would be beneficial for his weakened muscles. But as soon as she opened the gate, Shadow froze. His body tensed, his ears flattened against his head, and there was something resembling fear in his eyes. "It's all right, boy," Emma whispered soothingly, gently tugging on the reins. "No one will touch you. You're safe." But Shadow did not move. His hooves seemed rooted to the ground, and his breath became ragged. Emma let go of the reins, stepped aside, and sat down on the grass, showing that she would not force him. "Take your time," she said. "I'll wait." Henry, standing by the fence, shook his head but said nothing. He knew that in such matters, neither the horse nor the rider should be rushed. An hour passed. Emma sat calmly, occasionally exchanging words with Henry, but her gaze never left Shadow. The horse seemed to be struggling with itself. Its legs nervously shifted in place, its head rose and fell, and its eyes darted between the fence and the horizon. Finally, with a soft sigh, Shadow took the first step. He moved uncertainly, but then became a little steadier. Emma stood up but did not move toward him, allowing him to determine his own space. "That's it, boy," she whispered. "You can do it." When he stepped out into the spacious pasture, his movements became smoother. Shadow raised his head, sniffing the air as if enjoying the freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. Emma smiled, her heart filled with quiet joy. By evening, when the sun had set behind the hills, painting the valley in warm shades of orange and pink, Emma and Henry sat on the porch, watching the pasture. Shadow slowly walked through the grass, his silhouette standing out against the sunset. "You know, girl," Henry said after a long silence, "maybe there really is something in you. But remember, restoring trust is easy. Keeping it is another matter." Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on Shadow. "I know, Grandpa," she replied, "but I'm not going to give up. Not now that he's starting to believe." Henry smiled, stroking his cane again. "All right, then hold on to your faith tighter than the reins. It can take you further than you think." Emma looked at the sunset and at Shadow, who now looked a little more confident than in the morning. This day was a small step forward, but she knew that every victory, no matter how small, was especially significant. Fog enveloped the San Luis Valley in a thick veil, and the morning began quietly. The air was fresh, with a faint taste of moisture, foretelling rain. Emma stood at the gate of the pen, holding a bucket of feed for Shadow. His silhouette was barely visible through the gray haze. The horse moved slowly, still warily watching her every move. The first days of his stay at the ranch were difficult. Emma, although expecting challenges, was not prepared for how deep the wound in this horse's soul would be. He was not just physically exhausted. Fear had become his companion, imprinted in every movement. But it was this fear that strengthened her resolve. "We have only one way, Shadow," she said softly as the horse approached. "You have to trust me, just as I trust you." She carefully reached out her hand. Shadow froze, his ears twitched, as if trying to sense her intentions. Emma did not rush. She knew that any sudden movement could destroy the fragile bridge of trust they had begun to build. Finally, after a few tense seconds, Shadow took a step forward. His nostrils touched her palm, and this brief contact became a small but important victory for her. That day, Emma decided to take the next step, take Shadow out for his first training lesson. The goal was simple, to make him understand that working with a human was not associated with pain. She led him into a small, fenced circular pen where the ground was soft and the space protected. Henry stood to the side, leaning on his cane. His gaze was focused, but he said nothing, allowing Emma to handle it herself. He knew this was her path, and interfering would mean depriving her of the opportunity to learn. Emma started with simple signals. She held a long lead in her hand, allowing Shadow to move around her. At first, he tensed his muscles like strings ready to snap. Each of her steps, each movement of her hand, made him tremble. But she remained calm, her voice soft and confident. "It's all right, boy. No one will hurt you. Let's try together." Shadow slowly began to move, his steps uncertain, as if he feared that punishment would follow. Emma kept the lead loose, giving him space but maintaining contact to show that she was there. Each circle he completed seemed to her like a real miracle. His movements became a little smoother, the tension gradually eased. Emma noticed that in his eyes, there was a spark of something new, perhaps hope. Henry, watching this, finally broke the silence. "You're doing everything right, girl. The main thing is not to rush him. Horses, like people, must decide to trust on their own." Emma nodded, her attention focused on Shadow. She knew that this moment was important not only for him, but also for her. Each step he took was a step forward for her as well, a step toward understanding how to be patient and sensitive. In the evening, when the training was over, Emma led Shadow back to his pen. She noticed that his gait had become more confident, and his gaze was a little less wary. She left him a bucket of water and a few pieces of apple, which he accepted with surprising readiness. Sitting on the porch with Henry, Emma allowed herself to relax a little. The valley was quiet, the wind gently swayed the grass, and the stars began to slowly appear in the sky. "Do you think he'll ever be like he used to?" she asked, looking at her grandfather. Henry thoughtfully stroked his beard. "I think he can be even better than before, but only if you keep believing in him. Horses are amazing creatures, Emma. They can forgive a lot if they feel they won't be abandoned." Her gaze fell again on the pen, where Shadow stood calmly, his dark silhouette merging with the night shadow. She knew their journey was just beginning, but today's small victories filled her heart with confidence. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said softly, feeling not only wisdom but also support in his words. Henry smiled and patted her on the shoulder. "You're welcome, girl. You're doing it all yourself? I'm just an old man glad to watch." But the night was cool, and Emma felt warmer than ever. She knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but the thought no longer frightened her. Together with Shadow, they could handle anything. Early in the morning, when the sun had just begun to bathe the San Luis Valley in golden radiance, Emma stepped onto the porch. Her gaze stopped at the pen, where Shadow was leisurely moving around, exploring every corner. He looked more alive than in the first days when he had just arrived at the ranch. There was energy in his gait and curiosity in his eyes. Emma smiled. This progress, though slow, was a huge achievement for her. Not long ago, this horse avoided any contact. His movements were timid, as if every attempt at communication threatened a new blow. Now, despite the caution, Shadow trusted her enough to walk beside her. "Today we'll take another step, boy," she said softly, looking at him. She took the reins and gently called him. Shadow, hearing the familiar voice, turned his head and slowly approached. Emma carefully put a halter on him and stroked his warm nose. "Ready?" she asked, as if waiting for an answer. The horse slightly tilted his head, and this movement seemed to be a confirmation for her. The goal of the morning training was to ride beyond the ranch. Emma wanted to show Shadow the surrounding world, teach him not to be afraid of new sounds and smells. She understood that this could be a test for both of them, but knew that to move forward, they had to leave familiar boundaries. Henry watched her preparations with his usual squint. His hands, roughened from many years of work, held the old cane, and his gaze remained wise and calm. "Are you sure he's ready?" he asked, tilting his head. Emma nodded, securing the reins. "He'll handle it, and if something goes wrong, I'll be there." "All right, girl. Remember, the main thing is your confidence. The horse feels it's stronger than you think." She smiled and led Shadow to the exit. The horse moved slowly, his ears attentively catching the sounds of the surrounding world. They passed through the gate, leaving the pen behind, and stepped onto the trail leading to the hills. On the trail, the wind was cool, bringing the sense of grass and earth. Shadow initially walked with caution, looking around at every rustle, but Emma gently encouraged him, leading him forward. "It's all right," she said softly. "This is just a new world, and it's not scary." They walked past the wild sagebrush, and suddenly the sound of scattering birds made Shadow freeze. The horse tensed, his body still in anticipation of danger. Emma stood still, allowing him to get used to the sounds. "Look, it's just birds," she said, pointing to the flock circling in the distance. "They won't hurt you." Her voice was soft and even. Gradually, the tension in Shadow began to ease, and he took the first cautious step. Emma stroked his neck again. Good boy. You're getting braver. When they reached the foot of the hill, where the trail widened, Emma decided to give him a break. She untied the lead and allowed him to wander a bit. Shadow slowly approached a small stream, listening to the sound of the water, and carefully bent down to take a few sips. Emma sat on a rock nearby, watching him. She understood that for Shadow, every minute outside the ranch was a challenge, but his ability to adapt inspired her. In the evening, when they returned to the ranch, Henry was already waiting for them on the porch. His gaze was approving, and the corners of his mouth curled into a slight smile. You two look like a real team, he said when Emma removed the reins from Shadow. This is just the beginning, she replied, stroking the horse. But he proved he can do more than anyone thought. Henry nodded, his eyes filled with gentle pride. You're learning not only from him, but also teaching him. That's the most important lesson you can get. Emma led Shadow into his pen, where he lazily began to nibble on hay. She lingered for a moment, looking at him, and realized that today's walk not only strengthened their bond, but also gave her confidence that they could overcome anything. The night caught her sitting on the porch with Henry. The quiet wind whispered stories through the trees, and the stars, as if sharing her thoughts, twinkled in the sky. He was magnificent today, Grandpa, she said, breaking the silence. And so were you, Emma, he replied. But remember, the road is still long. She nodded, her thoughts returning to the events of the day. She knew that more challenges awaited them, but today's walk had given her one important understanding. She and Shadow were becoming true partners. The next morning in the San Luis Valley, when the sun was just beginning to rise from behind the hills, painting the world in soft pink and golden hues, Emma stepped out onto the porch again. Her gaze fell on Shadow, who seemed to be already waiting for her by the fence. His stance was confident, his eyes sparkled, and his ears slightly turned toward her, catching every sound. Henry stood by the pen gate with a rope in his hands. His stern face, usually full of wise restraint, was a bit softer. He watched intently as Emma prepared for their morning training. Today you need to show him that trust works both ways, he said, handing her the saddle. This will be his first real test. Emma looked at her grandfather, feeling her heart beat faster. She knew this moment was inevitable, but now that it had come, she felt a mixture of excitement and slight concern. Are you sure he's ready? She asked, gripping the reins tighter. Henry nodded. The question is not whether he is ready, but whether you are ready to trust him. Emma carefully approached Shadow, holding the saddle in her hands. The horse tensed slightly, but his eyes remained focused on Emma. She spoke to him softly, her voice calm and reassuring. You can do it, boy, she said, carefully placing the saddle on his back. This won't hurt, just a bit unfamiliar. Shadow stood still, allowing her to tighten the girth. Emma stepped back, watching his reaction closely. The horse slightly shook his head, but did not try to throw off the saddle. This was the first sign of trust. Henry stood nearby, his sharp gaze following every movement of Emma and her partner. Don't rush. Let him get used to it, he advised. Emma nodded, stepping closer and gently touching Shadow. All right, let's try now, she whispered. She placed her foot in the stirrup and carefully pulled herself up, sitting in the saddle. Shadow froze, his muscles tensed, but he did not move. Emma remained still, giving him time to realize what was happening. That's it, she said, stroking his neck. It's all right. I'm here. Gradually, Shadow relaxed. Emma felt his breathing become steadier, and she decided to take the first step. With a gentle tug on the reins, she signaled, and the horse slowly moved forward. The trail they followed was familiar to Emma, but for Shadow, it was a new world. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a challenge to him. Emma gently guided him, confidently holding the reins. Come on, boy, you're doing it, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. When they reached the first turn, Shadow paused. His ears sharply turned, catching something in the distance. Emma felt him tense beneath her, ready to bolt back. It's all right, she said, gripping the reins a bit tighter. It's just the wind. The horse hesitated, but did not give in to fear. Emma leaned down, stroked his neck, and gently nudged him forward. This was a small but important step, a step of trust. When they returned to the ranch, Henry was waiting for them at the gate. There was a rare smile on his face. "I see you two managed," he said, taking the reins from Emma. "It was a tough day, but he did more than I expected," she replied, dismounting. She removed the girth, and Shadow shook his head, as if releasing the tension. His eyes met hers, and at that moment, Emma realized that something more than just understanding had been born between them. It was a true partnership. In the evening, Emma sat on the porch, leaning against the railing. The stars had already begun to twinkle in the night sky, and the air was cool. Henry came out of the house and sat down next to her, holding a cup of hot tea in his hands. "You did well today, girl," he said, looking at her. "Thank you, Grandpa. But I know there's still a lot of work ahead." Henry nodded, his face becoming serious. "Yes, but today you proved that you can go further. And most importantly, you proved it to yourself." Emma looked at the pens, where Shadow was already peacefully resting, and smiled. She knew that this day had marked the beginning of something special. Now they were not just a horse and a rider, but a real team, ready to overcome any obstacles together.